Before I get into the actual video, I just wanted to do a really quick skip to the good stuff for those of you who've just Googled or are searching for how to do terrain blending in the first place, because this video is a little bit more than that in it, and I just wanted to show you if that's all you're looking for. So I'll quickly just jump into my master material here, and you see I've got the ground layer, the detail texture, and the actual blend functions down here. The blending distance to nearest surface is the distance field node that does distance field, distance to distance fields. And this is the blend. I'm blending multiplied by an edge distortion so that it's not just a straight gradient. You can see the lerp between the landscape and the asset texturing. And here I'm also doing a pixel depth offset dither at the edges. And this is how we get such a smooth lighting transition. If we come in real close, you can see that the meshes actually go a little bit transparent at the edges. But at a typical viewing angle, you're not going to notice that. All you're going to notice is that there's a nice soft transition between meshes and the terrain, and it gets rid of that hard edge. If you want to have a look at a less complex breakdown, where I got the idea for the pixel depth offset, and they're also doing just the distance field blending without too much fancy stuff in there. This blog post from Jory Camp on the Right of Oak website, they've used this in their game, and here's a really simple breakdown that you can use just to get terrain blending up and running. Alright, with that out the way, let's go to the full overview. Okay, so I'm going to talk for as short a time as possible about doing some terrain blending in Unreal. I'm not covering any hugely new ground. People have done all this stuff before, but I think people might be interested to see how I'm blending with unique terrain layers instead of just having one material and stuff like that. So without further ado, I'm just going to give you a quick TLDR version of what's going on. So we've got some examples around this world here. We've got some tessellated terrain going on, with a couple of layers being blended by a splat map, and we've got these rocks that blend in really nicely with the terrain, and you can see that they're taking the data from the terrain layers, and well, they have the same data that the terrain layers do, and they're all being tessellated in world space. So yeah, we'll go over here. This is just another example area that I was working on. You can see if we drag this rock into the sand, it grabs the sand and gets covered in rocks and etc etc. The ground texture is just being affected by a world aligned splat map. It's actually being tiled, so it's not in landscape UV space at the moment. And if we come over here, we can have a look, and I've got actually all of the objects in the material have a world aligned detail, so even if they don't have a one-to-one asset texture and normal like these rocks over that I showed you, they can just have the world space detail texture, I guess, and blend together with that. The red is the object's own detail texture, and the grey is the ground, and you can see here that we've got some nice blending going on with the distance. It sort of disappears into the ground, and there's an edge distortion going on as well. And yeah, if we'll come over here and we'll have a look at what else we can do. Here's another example of just like a large scale terrain using that same terrain map, terrain material as down there, and we're blending some rocks into it over here, and these all blend in really nicely, etc etc. And finally, another use of this material, and probably the actual original reason I set it up, was so that I could do these nice overhangs. Dice has been doing these a lot, and I think they look really sick. And we can see here that these rocks are actually just blending straight in with the landscape. If we go to visualize and just visualize the landscape load, you can see these white areas are the landscape, and then the rest of them are the rocks. And that's all just using the same material but in a slightly different different fashion to down lower on. And I've got another example up here. So this terrain is just being textured by slope. So the flat areas have sand and the steeper areas have the rock texture. And up here we've just merged in a whole bunch of rocks into the terrain. There's not many, there's like 10. Is that 10? And if we go, we can just disable those and you can see before and after. Of them being blended in quite nicely. So yeah, I was able to throw these rocks out real quickly, and because they're just tiled using the world space triplanar material, they blend in really nicely. So now I've shown you all the pretty stuff. Let's go and have a real quick look at what the landscape material parameters look like. This is nothing fancy at all. It's just got layer 1, layer 2, and some tessellation settings, and the splat. So that's nothing fancy. And we'll go and have a look at the master material because that's where some stuff is interesting. So on the landscape, there's nothing special about the landscape. It's a landscape with two ground layers, triplanar projection. This is just pulled out of the material function while I've been experimenting, and while I'm not quite sure where it's going to end up, I've wanted to have full access to get the pack channels out and blend them with other bits and pieces if I needed to. And those are just being blended by material function. So I've got this terrain splat blend. This is just the world aligned splat map. So nothing fancy here. You can look up doing world space triplanar stuff if you want. I don't need to get into it, but nothing special in the terrain. If we come over to the master material now, for the actual objects, we'll see here these are the ground layers, which I will eventually put into material functions, either so I have just a terrain material function maybe, or each layer is a material function depending on how I decide to do some things down the line. So at the moment I've just got those copied into the actual asset material. So this material is what's on all of the rocks doing all the blending and stuff like that. We have the world space detail texture. That's the one that I showed you on the cliffs over here. And it's also on, that's what we're seeing on the red material instances as well, because they don't have a one-to-one asset texture. And just some blending between the detail stuff. Not a fancy implementation. I could definitely add more to like add normal strength. The main focus of this material has been getting it up and running before making anything look super amazing. And this is the part that you probably care about. So these nodes here are doing the distance blend, and this is just a world aligned edge distortion. So if we have a look down here, you can see that there's a nice, it's not just a smooth gradient, just typical bog standard run-of-the-mill layer masking stuff in Unreal. And I've just done that triplanar as well, so that they can all the objects merge with each other and will all line up if they're next to each other. So distance to nearest surface is the distance field node that's doing all of the heavy lifting. The rest of this is just masking. And something else that I'm doing is using pixel depth offset to dither the edges of the meshes when they're near stuff. So I got this idea from a great blog post when I was looking for a better way to deal with the hard lighting surface. These guys did it in the game Ride of Ilk. So thanks to Jory Camp at Turtleneck Studios, who posted his nodes for this, and I thought that was a great idea. The reason mine's a bit different is I'm just doing some switches so that I can enable it or disable it real easy with a check mark. And I also found that blending this edge distortion in to the pixel depth offset was giving me some strange artifacting. So I just removed the pixel depth offset. Sorry, I moved the edge distortion, which are the wavy edges instead of just smooth. Remove that from the pixel depth offset so that this was just a straight gradient at the very edges. So this is what the material instance looks like. Cool, so you can see we've got the ground layers, we've got the detail texture, which is just being blended in. If I make this like red tile, you can see that that's being blended in on top of the world space, or the object space texture, I should say. We've got a normal flatten here. If I put that down to 0, you can see that where the sand is being blended on, the sand and the rock texture is still being affected by the object's normals. So I just included this normal flatten so that the sand has just its own normal, and isn't being blended with the object underneath it. So you might want it not to flatten the normal if you're blending like paint or something. Some objects would take more of the underlying shape or fit closely on the surface. And so down to the good stuff, the terrain blending. So power is just how sharp the edge is, or how soft the edge is. You can change this to your liking. I think harder actually, like softer makes it feel they're just fading it together, but harder I think looks a bit more impressive to me. Of course you wanna play with it, so because you do need it to be a bit soft, otherwise you still get hard edges. But making this a bit harder, it's sort of, as someone interested in tech art anyway, I'd be like, damn, they're blending meshes, hey? Not just like, they're fading meshes into each other, even though that's what we're doing. So let's have a look. Distance fade scale. This, of course, or maybe not, of course, affects how far away from the ground we fade into the other material. And the last little bit of magic is this dither one. So you can see at the moment I've got dithering off and we're just blending the texture together. And you can see there's quite a hard edge, even though it's got the same texture, particularly because there's a significantly different lighting hitting at different angles here. Without dithering, it still looks a bit hard, even though it's the same material. But if we turn on dithering, it really softens that up a lot, and it's how we get these really nice soft edges. Now, I've probably turned that on way too high. I think 5 is a much more reasonable value. Now, of course, it's not perfect, but you probably just saw then what the main caveat of using dithering is. And if you dither too much, dithering at all actually, you're essentially making the object a bit transparent. So right now we're seeing through the object to the ground on the other side. So you need to have that dithering setting down reasonably low, and it definitely has its caveats. So it'll probably fall apart faster in VR, but for the most part it works really well. The other option you have is using the distance field gradient to affect, and you can modify the normals at edges, but distance fields are pretty unreliable as it is, and I've found that node, it's really expensive and it doesn't get perfect results anyway, and for the render cost, it'd want to get perfect results. So I'm going to take a quick pause and then I'm going to come back and talk about caveats of this approach. So there are 2.5, 3 main caveats with using distance fields. One is distance field. If you're using the shadowing feature of distance fields, everything near a mesh is going to blend into it. So if I grab this cube, you'll see obviously a cube. If I grab this sphere and move it in near the rock, you'll see that the rock is blending with the sphere's distance field, even though the sphere has some random own material on it. So if you're going to use distance field shadowing on your meshes and have your meshes all have distance field enabled on them, you're going to have to handle blending with anything with distance fields, not just the terrain. That's why my next step in this process is going to be looking at reading the terrain height and splat data from the engine directly and applying that to my materials, as opposed to using the distance field to determine where it blends. So one approach from this, I should say, is you can just, one way around this, I should say, wrong place, I'm typing that. You can just disable effect distance field lighting, of course. Now, this is perfectly viable if you're not going to use distance field ambient occlusion or distance field ray trace shadows for distance shadows. But if you want to use the actual features of distance field lighting and have blending, you'll need to handle this. Maybe all of your meshes blend into the same blend material, something like that. But something to keep in mind. The other thing that I'd like to point out is that distance fields, I'm going to drag this one up into the air. Now, at the moment, this rock blends with all distance fields, and it's not having any artifacting issues that we can see up in the air, which is really nice. And this is because, and I'll just go and show you the mesh here. There's a setting called two-sided distance field generation. Now, by default, this is disabled, but I've enabled it on this mesh because if I disable it, I'll show you what happens. With that setting disabled, you get a much less detailed distance field, I think is what's happening. I don't really understand the depths of the distance field system, but basically, without two-sided distance fields enabled, you get this self-sampling artifact really bad from meshes. So if you have that setting disabled, your mesh is always going to have distance fields near it because it's its own distance field, so it's always going to have a bit of the blended material in it. If I go in and set our distance blend distance to 0, you can see that it's sampling itself because all of these values are -0 in distance from the mesh's surface. And that's why they all have got sand on them, even though we've got that blending distance to 0. So you could probably write some offset code in your blend function and have less accurate intersections, and you might get away with that with just using the terrain. I think that's what some people have recommended. But personally, the two-sided trick works for me. It causes other issues and it's a bit less performant, I should say. But just enabling two-sided distance field is the workaround I use to deal with self-sampling. And I'll just show you again. So without that and with it. So keep that in mind. And the other thing that I wanted to show you was that performance is not the best thing in the world. Using distance fields in this manner isn't cheap. You'll see here that the shader complexity, while not abysmal, is quite bad on rocks with this material on them. You'll see all of the rocks here have that material. But the trick that I'm using to work around that is that I've got a near LOD material instance and a far. They're all the same material. They've all got the same master, I should say. But my far LOD has just got the terrain blending disabled. And you'll see here as we zoom out of this scene, as the rocks transition to the far LOD, they switch down to the material without blending and they get a whole heck of a lot cheaper. So I think this is a very adequate approach. These LODs are auto-generated. And I haven't really tuned them very nicely, so you'll see when I actually view them, you see more of the pop-in than the actual transition from blending to not blending. But on these smaller ones here, you can see a little bit better the transition between blended and not blended. So you'll definitely need to tune your LOD transition and when it switches the material based on how far away they are from the camera, of course. So you don't see too much of this blending pop in because it exaggerates the amount of pop in your LEDs. But that can be an option if you want to use these in a larger environment or on more rocks and still negate some of that distance field cost. So yeah, those couple of pitfalls of using distance fields. That's why my next area of inquiry is going to be into reading from the terrain. If you have any questions, feel free to hit me up on Twitter or on the comments here, but Twitter is better because I probably won't check the comments here that often. And I hope that this has been interesting or educational or something for you.